The Amazing Race 18 is the 18th installment of the reality television show The Amazing Race. The Amazing Race 18 featured 11 teams of €2 each returning from a previous edition for the first time since season 11 €1 in a race around the world for a $1 million prize. The 18th cycle started on Sunday, February 20, 2011. It aired on CBS in the United States on Sunday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern Time PT with a 2-hour season finale on May 8, 2011. The show is hosted by Phil Keoghan. It is the first American season of The Amazing Race to be filmed and broadcast in high definition. Sisters Kisha and Jen Hoffman from season 14 were the winners of this season. The complete season was released on DVD on September 8, 2015. Via Amazon.com's Create Space program. Production Development and filming The Amazing Race 18 was the first season of the United States series to be broadcast in high-definition television. While most other primetime television shows have transitioned to high definition, including other reality television shows, previous seasons of The Amazing Race have used standard definition television due to the cost and fragility of high-definition recording equipment. International versions of The Amazing Race, including the fourth Asian and second Latin American seasons, had already transitioned to high definition. In addition, many previous editions of Elimination Station were filmed in high definition. This season of the race traveled a little over 40,000 miles across 23 cities and 5 continents. Filming started on November 20, 2010 at the San Gorgonio Pass wind farm near Palm Springs, California, where the first task had teams sorting through hundreds of paper airplanes to find one that said Queensland and Northern Territory Aerial Services, the full name of Qantas Airways, awarding them one of 2 flights to their first destination, Sydney, Australia. Teams were spotted at Ocean World and Manly near Sydney, Australia around November 22, 2010 and a day later around the mining town of Broken Hill, New South Wales in the Australian outback. Other locales cited as destinations are Yokohama, Japan, where teams swam in freezing waters near Mount Fuji, and the series' first visit to Liechtenstein, where a task had teams measure the length of the principality on mopeds. Teams also visited Lijiang and Kunming, China, Kolkata and Varanasi, India, Vienna, Austria, Zermatt, Switzerland, and Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Snapple sponsored this season of The Amazing Race, with Snapple Real Facts introduced during commercial breaks. The sixth leg of Unfinished Business taking place in Kolkata, India features several tasks involving a papaya and mango-flavored tea Snapple developed and named after the show. Ford also sponsored the season, with their new Focus serving as the prize car for the season. The Express Pass, introduced in the previous series, returned, allowing the team that places first in the first leg to skip any later task in the race. The last team to complete the first task was forced to complete a U-turn in the next leg, performing both tasks of the leg's detour. A new game mechanic was also introduced in this season, legs without a mandatory rest period between them. At the end of the first leg in Sydney, Australia, and the fourth leg in Lijiang, China, teams were told their placements and then ordered to keep racing with a new route info clue. The first team to check in was still awarded a prize and the last team to check in was not eliminated and did not have to perform a speed bump in the next leg. Casting The 18th season of The Amazing Race has been subtitled Unfinished Business, and features 11 returning teams from previous seasons for a second chance to win the $1 million prize. Keoghan described all the contestants as teams that came so close to winning but for one reason or another just didn't quite make it over the finish line in first place. Keoghan gave examples of 2 teams, Zev and Justin from season 15, who had finished first on a leg, but one of them had lost his passport too late to continue racing. And Kisha and Jennifer from season 14, where they took an unfortunately timed restroom break while racing to the pit stop and were eliminated. The prior experience of all the teams in previous seasons allowed the producers to increase the difficulty of the various tasks and challenges they were to face. All of the teams have been from recent seasons of the race. The earliest season represented is the 12th. According to Bertram van Munster, they stayed with more recent teams because if we're digging too far back, people might not even remember who they were. The 14th season is represented by 5 of the 11 teams. Van Munster called this particular version of the race a very unique season, and justified its larger proportion of teams. Though they had considered fan favourites Tony and Dallas from the 13th season, Keoghan stated they felt the other selected teams have the best stories and the best motivation for casting. The returning teams, their prior race placements, and their unfinished business are, from season 12, Ron and Christina Shue, father and daughter, second place. Ron and Christina had a huge lead for most of the final leg in Anchorage, until Christina was brought down by the final mind-blowing roadblock, costing them the race. Kent Caliber and Vixen Fiala, dating goths and Hot Topic models, 5th place. Kent and Vixen suffered a communications breakdown in Tuscany due to their lack of experience driving a car with a manual transmission. They also wasted their U-turn power by erroneously using it on a team that was ahead of them. From season 14, Margie and Luke Adams, mother and son, 3rd place. Although Margie and Luke were in the lead for most of the final leg in Maui, Luke stumbled at the final roadblock, costing them the race. Amanda Blackwell and Chris Clicker, engaged, 8th place. Amanda and Chris were U-turned by Margie and Luke in Siberia, resulting in Amanda and Chris's elimination. Jaime Edmondson and Cara Rosenthal, former cheerleaders for the NFL's Miami Dolphins, 2nd place. Jaime and Cara's cab driver in Maui got lost on the way to the final roadblock destination, costing Jaime and Cara valuable time. Kisha and Jen Hoffman, sisters and sports coaches, 4th place. Kisha and Jen were U-turned by Tammy and Victor in Beijing, China. In addition, on the way to the pit stop, Kisha and Jen took an emergency bathroom break after Jen drank 4 bottles of water during the roadblock. As a result, they were overtaken and Kisha and Jen fell to last place and were eliminated. Mel and Mike White, father and son writers, 6th place. Mel and Mike's cab driver took them to the wrong place in Phuket, setting them behind all the other teams. Mel and Mike could not recover from this setback and were eliminated. From season 15, Zev Glassenberg and Justin Canyu, best friends, 9th place. After checking in first in Phnom Penh, Zev and Justin realized they had lost Zev's passport and they were unable to find it before all other remaining teams checked in, resulting in Zev and Justin's elimination. Herbert Flight Time Lang and Nathaniel Big Easy Lofton, teammates on the Harlem Globetrotters, 4th place. Big Easy could not complete the Kafka-themed roadblock in Prague and took a 4-hour penalty, resulting in Flight Time and Big Easy's elimination. From season 16, Jet and Cord McCoy, brothers and rodeo cowboys, 2nd place. On the plane from Shanghai to San Francisco, eventual winners Dan and Jordan were able to move up to first class for free, giving them a lead that Jet and Cord were never able to overcome. From season 17, Gary and Mallory Irvine, father and daughter, 6th place. Gary and Mallory got lost for several hours trying to find the roadblock location in Oman, only lost 5 minutes before the 5th team arrived at the pit stop. Results: the following teams participated in the race, each listed along with their placements in each leg and relationships as identified by the program. Note that this table is not necessarily reflective of all content broadcast on television, owing to the inclusion or exclusion of some data. Placements are listed in finishing order. A red team placement means the team was eliminated. A purple I micron indicates that the team decided to use the express pass on that leg. An underlined leg number indicates that there was no mandatory rest period at the pit stop and all teams were ordered to continue racing. The first place team was still awarded a prize for that leg. An underlined blue team's placement indicates that the team came in last on a non-elimination leg and had to perform a speed bump during the next leg of the race. An orange indicates that the team was penalized for finishing last in the starting line task and was subject to an automatic U-turn at the first detour of the race. A brown ash fluorine or a cyano indicates that the team chose to use one of the 2 U-turns in a double U-turn. Ash aura indicates the team who received it. AA around a leg number indicates that only one of the two available U-turns was used. Episode title quotes. Episode titles are often taken from quotes made by the racers. Head down and hold on a Jaime and Cara's sailing instructor. I never looked so foolish in my whole entire life. A Kisha, we had a lot of evil spirits. Apparently a Christina, this is the most stupid day ever. A Vixen, don't ruin the basketball game. A Mallory, I feel like a monkey in a circus parade. A Gary, you don't get paid unless you win. A Cord, I cannot deal with your psycho behavior. A Vixen, we good American people. A Zev, too many cooks in the kitchen. A Zev, this is where it ends. A Justin. Prizes, the prize for each leg is awarded to the first place team for that leg. All trips are sponsored by Travelocity. The Leg 6 prize is sponsored by Snapple and the Leg 8 prize is sponsored by Ford. Leg 1 €, the Express Pass €, an item that can be used on the race to skip any one task of the team's choosing. Leg 2 €, a trip for 2 to Cancun, Mexico. Leg 3 €, a trip for 2 to the Hotel Punta Isleta in Costa Rica. Leg 4 €, a trip for 2 to Aruba. Leg 5 €, $5,000 each. Leg 6 €, an Indian dinner for 2 featuring Bollywood-inspired dance entertainment, and to the first 1 million to share. Leg 7 €, a trip for 2 to Hawaii. Leg 8 €, a 2012 Ford Focus for each racer. Leg 9 €, a trip for 2 to Kuala Section No. Leg 10 €, a trip for 2 to the Cook Islands. Leg 11 €, a cruise for 2 on the Mediterranean Sea with visits to Rome and Casablanca. Leg 12 €, $1 million. Phil's Video Diary, a new feature to this season, is an online show, allowing the viewers to see what happens behind the scenes of the race, hosted by Keoghan. This feature replaces the Elimination Station videos as seen in previous seasons. Episode 1, the night before the first leg, Phil prepares to meet the 11 teams at Palm Springs, California. He then films the helicopter shot scene at the start of the episode. While traveling to Sydney, Phil explains that the flight had been delayed, meaning that the pit stop crew then only had a small time advantage over the teams. The final portion of the diary shows Phil filming the pit stop segment. Episode 2, Phil films the establishing shot for Shelley Beach and quickly cleans his hair outside, revealing he had not showered before the film crew left Los Angeles. As they drive to Ocean World Manly to film the Roadblock's establishing shots, Phil sticks his head out of the car window to dry it. Later, Phil explains that they are now flying back to Sydney to catch a flight to Japan, and at the airport, he plays around on the luggage carousel, pretending to be a piece of luggage. Episode 3, Phil and the production crew arrive in Narita, Japan, and Phil explains why he loves to visit Japan. They head to the Yui Falls featured in the Prayer of Purity detour task, enjoying the scenery, before explaining the task to his diary camera and then filming the piece for the show. Episode 4, the film crew lands in Lijiang, China, and Phil explains the Beshi River crossing tourist attraction before filming the explanation for the Yak 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 task. After the group heads to the top of Jade Dragon Mountain, Phil shares some grilled yak with one of the film crew, before the filming of the Roadblock explanation in Spruce Meadow is shown. Episode 5, the film crew arrives in Kunming and Phil prepares to film the explanation of the Embrace the Future detour task, before poking fun at Barry, the sound technician, and how he has lost his voice. Later, while on the way to the Stone Forest, Barry has his voice back, and they film the Roadblock segment using time-lapse photography. Phil then comments on how the competition has ramped up on Leg 5 and he is interested in who will come in first on the leg. Episode 6, Phil and the production team arrive in Kolkata, and Phil remarks at how empty the streets are at 3 o'clock in the morning. By daybreak, the streets are full of cars and people, and Phil remarks on how he loves it when the race goes to India. Phil arrives in Jorasanko to explain the detour tasks, and then they visit the Victoria Institution School for the end of the Bengali literature detour task. At the pit stop location, Phil plays cricket with several local children until he breaks the bat, and apologizes to them, before filming the establishing shot for the pit stop. Episode 7, in Varanasi, Phil remarks on how busy the city is in the morning, much like Kolkata. Phil walks down towards the Ganges, looking at the vegetable stalls on the way to the river. On the Ganges to film the detour segments, Phil relaxes and says how he is enjoying traveling on the river. The film crew then heads to Ramnagar Fort to wait at the pit stop, where Phil once again enjoys watching the Ganges as the sun sets. Episode 8, arriving in Vienna from Delhi, Phil remarks on how different the weather is from India, as it is winter in the northern hemisphere. Phil walks through one of Vienna's Christmas markets before heading to the Austrian National Library where he rides on a horse-drawn carriage before filming the detour introduction where the detour choices are named Father of Psychoanalysis, and Mother of All Meals, rather than Long Hard Walk, and Quick and Easy Meal. The crew then heads to the Sigmund Freud Museum for the Freud's Couch detour before going to the Wiener Reisenrad for the eating detour, where Barry eats a serving of Wiener Schnitzel, while a microphone is up against the schnitzel. Episode 9, the crew arrives in Zermatt, Switzerland, and Phil films the bus they rode and the surroundings. He then walks down the main street to the detour tasks, commenting on how they only allow electric vehicles in the city. Later, Phil attempts to figure out how the VAR copyright Los Sol X works, before he writes it in the Liechtenstein Roadblock explanation. Episode 10, Phil and the film crew leave their hotel early in the morning to head for the helicopter port that will take them onto the glaciers of the Matterhorn to film the detour segment. They then take a gondola lift back down the mountain to Zermatt. Episode 11, Phil takes in the view of Rio de Janeiro's Copacabana beach from his balcony, before heading to the beauty salon where a few crew members are being used to demonstrate the waxing route marker. Later, they head to the Nitra Cubed Eye Contemporary Art Museum to prepare for the pit stop and film the portion explaining the museum before the next leg begins. Race summary. Leg 1 . Air date, February 20, 2011, Palm Springs, California, United States, Los Angeles to Sydney, New South Wales, Australia, Mascot to Sydney, Sydney to Manly, 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 Manly. At the starting line at San Gorgonio Pass Wind Farm, teams had to search through a field containing hundreds of paper airplanes with various words written on them for one matching the clue Queensland and Northern Territory Aerial Services, and had to figure out that this was a reference to Qantas, which was written on the correct airplanes. Once teams presented a correct airplane to Phil, he would give them their first route info clue and tickets for one of two flights to their first destination, Sydney, Australia. The first 8 teams got tickets for the first flight, and the last 3 teams got tickets for a flight that left 90 minutes after the first. In addition, the last team to complete the task would be penalised with a U-turn on the race's first detour. Upon arriving in Sydney, teams had to take by train to Circular Quay in Sydney Harbour. They then took a ferry to Manly and made their way to Ocean World Manly for the first roadblock, where teams asked, "Who's ready to get tanked?" One team member had to scuba dive in the Ocean World Shark and Ray tank and search the tank for a compass. The compass included a guide to decode a message hidden in a series of nautical flags outside. The correctly decoded message instructed teams to go to the Manly 16 Feet Skiff Sailing Club, find the Commodore, and tell him the password "I am between the devil and the deep blue sea" to receive their next clue. The clue received and teams changed into wetsuits. Then they had to join a sailing crew and ride a 16-feet skiff through a race course to a series of buoys that had their next clue. The clue directed the teams to Shelley Beach for the pit stop. However, Phil gave teams their next clue and ordered them to keep racing. Leg 2 . Air date, February 27, 2011, Sydney, Sydney to Broken Hill, Broken Hill, Broken Hill, Broken Hill, Broken Hill. Teams received the clue at the pit stop, instructed them to find a sail to stop, and left them to figure that this referred to a sculpture of an anchor near Sydney Town Hall. There, they could sign up for one of 2 charter flights to Broken Hill in the outback, the second of which left half an hour later than the first. Upon arriving in Broken Hill, teams picked up their clues at the windshield of race-provided vehicles and had to drive to the Living Desert Reserve where they found their detour clue, a choice of Spirit World and Natural World. In Spirit World, teams made a traditional Australian Aboriginal stone mosaic based on a model, and then had to perform a dance that is traditionally done to honor ancestors on top of the mosaic before receiving their clue from an Aboriginal elder. In Natural World, teams made traditional Australian Aboriginal paintings by spraying a mix of water and a clay-like pigment out of their mouths to make 4 specific silhouette images on a piece of slate, before they could receive their clue from an Aboriginal elder. As for Amanda and Chris, they finished last in the starting line task in the previous leg. They did take both detours as part of the automatic U-turn. The detour clues received teams had to find the home of the Magpies, leaving them to figure out that this was a reference to the Broken Hill Football League's Central Magpies Australian Rules football team stadium, Central Football Club. At the football club, teams dressed up as kangaroos complete with kangoo jump shoes and were given a periodic table with the symbols H, G and B highlighted. They were left to figure out that these are respectively the symbols for Mercury and Bismuth and that those elements were also names of 2 streets in town that met at an intersection where their next clue was located, sending them to Junction Mine for the pit stop. Leg 3 Air date, March 6, 2011, Broken Hill to Haymarket, Sydney to Tokyo, Japan, Tokyo, Kamakura, Minamiyashigura, Kuriyama, Yokosuka. During the pit stop, all teams took a train back into Sydney to start the leg. Teams were given their next clue, and instructed them to travel to Tokyo, Japan. Upon arrival, they headed to rotating parking garage and chose a marked car inside the garage where they were to pick up their next clue. The clue where teams had to head to Tsuragaoka Hashimanga in Kamakura for the roadblock, asking, who wants to go back 1,000 years in time? One team member dressed in the traditional clothes of a samurai archer and learned the Uber-same ritual through observation, consisting of a meditative form ritual before a traditional posing with the Yumi bow. Once they performed the first 2 aspects of the ritual to the dojo master's satisfaction, they would then mount a rotating wooden horse and hit a wooden target with an arrow before they could receive their next clue. The clue led them to travel to Daiyazan Station in Minamiyashigura and they picked the traditional Japanese-inspired detour clue, a choice between Prayer of Purity and Frog of Luck. In Prayer of Purity, teams put on keikaji and traveled to the nearby woods where they would take part in a Shinto cleansing ritual. First they would have to learn a prayer that consisted of a chant, lighting incense, and then shouting while thrusting a walking stick out in front of them. Once they completed the prayers, they would stand under the Yui Falls and endure being drenched in 45°F Fahrenheit water cascading down onto them for 1 minute before receiving their next clue. In Frog of Luck, teams stripped down to their undergarments and put on fundoshi over them before walking out to a mud pit where they had to search for a toy frog in the mud while having mud thrown at them by locals. Once they found the frog, they would have to present it to the nearby frog master for their next clue. The clue directed the teams to Commodore Perry Monument in Yokosuka for the pit stop. Leg 4 Air date, March 13, 2011, Tokyo to Kunming, China, Kunming to Lijiang. Kunming to Lijiang, 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 Lijiang. At the start of the leg, teams were told to travel to Lijiang, China, but they had to take a provided flight to Kunming in their arrangements and they then took a train to Lijiang. Upon arrival, they had to head to Jade Dragon Mountain. Teams had to properly saddle a yak, after which one team member rode the yak across a portion of the Beshi River to receive their next clue. The clue received sending teams to Spruce Meadow and rode a gondola up the mountain for the roadblock, asking, who thinks they're living a charmed life? One team member had to search through tens of thousands of wooden charms for a set of 12 that correspond to the symbols of the Chinese zodiac. Once they collected the charms, they had to place them on a mobile in the correct order, which was the traditional procession of the signs according to myth: rat, ox, tiger, rabbit, dragon, snake, horse, goat, monkey, rooster, dog and pig before they could receive their next clue. The clue received teams instructing them to Old Town of Lijiang, and they had to put a wish into a prayer wheel via a slot that corresponded to their sign in the Chinese zodiac, and call out the name of their sign. Once they got the right signs, they would receive their next clue, which it discovered for the detour, hammer or horn. In hammer, teams traveled to a candy shop where they used wooden mallets to pulverize a peanut brittle into the right consistency. They then had to cut it into pieces and box them before the candy maker would give them their next clue. In horn, teams traveled to a square where they had to pick up a large traditional horn and lead a group of Naki dancers to Wencheng Palace on the other side of town for their next clue. The clue teams were they received and directed to Eternal Tower on Lion Hill for the pit stop, but Phil asked all teams to continue racing. Leg 5 equals. Air date, March 20, 2011, Lai Jiang to Kunming, Shilanyu Autonomous County, Kunming. Teams received their clues at the pit stop, instructed them to take a train back to Kunming, with an inform of the U-turn in this leg. Upon arrival in Kunming, they had to travel to Downham Flower Market and search their next clue from amongst the flowers, directing them to Golden Horse and Jade Cock Memorial Archway to locate their next clue. The clue were found out that was for the detour, a choice between honor the past and embrace the future. In honor the past, teams had to put on a traditional Tibetan outfit at the Yunnan Province Cultural Center and then watch a theater troupe. Without having taken any notes, teams then had to go off stage, and put a series of 15 dolls dressed up like the actors in the order of the procession on stage. If they got the right order, they would receive their clue. If not, they would have to start over. In Embrace the Future, teams had to put on safety gear and then bring 3 heavy boxes up to the roof of the China Great Wall Assets Management Company building. Once there, they had to help assemble a solar water heating system before they could receive their next clue. The clues after the detour where they had only given a photo of their next location and were left to figure out that it was the Yunnan Province Cultural Center, the location of the U-turn board. Kent and Vixen chose to U-turn Jaime and Cara, while Jaime and Cara chose to U-turn Flight Time and Big Easy. The clue after the U-turn where teams sent to Stone Forest for the roadblock, asking, who's ready for a task 65 million years in the making. One team member had to assemble a life-size 20-foot-long model of a Dilophosaurus. Once the model was properly built, a paleontologist would give them their next clue. If at any point the paleontologist believed that the model was structurally unsafe, the racer would have to start over. The clue teams received sending them to Green Lake for the pit stop. Leg 6 equals. Air date, March 27, 2011, Kunming to Kolkata, India, Kolkata. The leg where it began and teams opened their next clue, where they sent to Jin Fuyi's and tea shop. They had to take part in a Chinese tea tasting ceremony where they were given a taste of the papaya and mango-infused tea that, unbeknownst to them at the time, would be featured in the upcoming Roadblock to their next destination, Kolkata, India. Along with their next clue, they were given a brick of tea leaves that would also be used in the Roadblock. Upon arriving in Kolkata, teams had to head to Kolkata Town Hall for the Roadblock, where they asked, who's ready to drink in the scenery? One team member had to take part in an Indian tea tasting ceremony. First, they had to take a papaya, a mango, and the brick of tea the teams received before left Kunming to the tea auctioneer. Then, they had to search among several hundred teacups for one that held the same papaya and mango-infused tea that they tasted in China. Once they got the right tea, the auctioneer would give them their next clue. The clue received after the Roadblock, they were given a bottle of Snapple iced tea and were left to figure out that their next clue was printed on the inside of the lid, directing them to go to the Jorazanko Thakabari and then search for the Taiwari tea stall. Upon reaching the Taiwari tea stall, teams traded the Snapple bottle for their next clue, the detour. The choice between Hindu art and Bengali literature. In Hindu art, teams traveled to the Rakhal Paul and Son statue shop where they had to paint and then dress a statue of the Hindu god Ganesha. Once it was complete, they would receive their next clue. In Bengali literature, teams traveled to the Day's publishing house and picked up 8 bundles of the children's book Introduction to the Bengali Alphabet. They then got into a rickshaw school bus and traveled across town to the Victoria Institution High School and College and searched the grounds for the offices of the headmistress of the primary school where they would deliver the books and receive their next clue. The clue teams directed to the pit stop at Maiden's Fountain of Joy, Leg 7 equals. Air date, April 10, 2011, Kolkata to Varanasi, 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 Ramnagar. At the start of the leg, teams were informed they had to travel to the holy city of Varanasi. Upon arrival, they had to head to Tongastan where they discovered for the roadblock, asking, "Who's ready to search for the meaning of life?" One team member had to search the streets near the Tonga stand for 6 different sages who would give out one of 6 pieces of a phrase described as the meaning of life. Once you're over the hill you pick up speed. Once the racer had all 6 fragments of the phrase, he or she would have to provide the phrase to a 7th sage who would give them their next clue. The clue instructed teams to Tulsi Hat, and searched their next clue, which was for the detour, Feed the Fire and Feed the Buffalo. In Feed the Fire, teams traveled down the Ganges to Saqqara to the home of a milkman where they had to make 50 traditional fuel patties made from water buffalo manure and then slap them against a wall to allow them to dry. When the supervisor was satisfied with their work, teams had to light a stove with dried fuel patties to boil milk for local children before receiving their clue. In Feed the Buffalo, the teams had to cross the Ganges to collect 2 bales of hay, which were to be delivered to the addresses attached to them. The teams were then required to return over the Ganges to Ksameshwarat, where they had to locate the addresses to which they were to deliver the hay. Upon delivery, they got their next clue. Teams sent them to Ramnagar Fort for the pit stop. Leg 8 equals. Air date, April 17, 2011, Varanasi to Vienna, Austria, Schalak, Vienna, Vienna, Salzburg, Salzburg. At the start of the leg, teams were informed they had to head to Vienna, Austria. Upon arrival in Vienna International Airport, teams went into one of the parking garages and chose a Ford Focus. Once inside the car, teams received a message from Phil directing them to put the car in reverse to activate the My Ford Touch's rear-view camera system for their next clue. As they backed up, teams would be able to read the name of their next destination spelled out on the pavement behind the car, Schloss Schalleberg. Upon arriving at Schalleberg Castle, teams were given a large book with a stamp on the front page with the text, Librarian Prunksaal Österreichische Nationalbibliothek, directing them to go to the Austrian National Library and find the librarian of the Prunksaal section with whom they would exchange the book for their next clue, which it was for the detour, the choice between Long Hard Walk and Quick and Easy Meal. In Long Hard Walk, teams traveled to the Sigmund Freud Museum to pick up a psychoanalysis couch, like the ones he used in his sessions, and then deliver it to his former office at the University of Vienna approximately 1 mile away where they would receive their next clue. In Quick and Easy Meal, teams traveled to the Wiener Reisenrad Ferris wheel where they picked up 2 large servings of the varied forms of traditional Austrian cuisine, Wiener Schnitzel, sauerkraut, and Saschtorte. They then boarded one of the Reisenrad's dining cars where, while a violinist played some Viennese music, they would have to finish both servings within 1 12-minute revolution of the Ferris wheel before receiving their next clue. If they could not finish, they would have to start over. The clue teams received in Vienna, and they had to drive to Salzburg and find Sternberg Currency U restaurant where they encountered the roadblock, asking, "Who's feeling lucky as lucky can be?" One team member chose a chimney sweep instructor and then put on the traditional chimney sweep uniform. They then went to the roof of the building and used a weight with wire mesh on a rope to clean one of the chimneys 3 times. Once complete, they went to the basement and opened up one of the chimney cleaning doors that held their next clue. The clue received directing them to Villa Trap for the pit stop. Leg 9 equals. Air date, April 24, 2011, Salzburg to Feldkirch, Scharenwald, Liechtenstein, Balzers to Sargans, Switzerland, Sargans to Zermatt, Zermatt. At the start of the leg, teams had to take a train to Feldkirch. Upon arrival, they had to head to the border crossing entering Liechtenstein. Once teams arrived in the town of Scharenwald, they had to pick up their clue. For Gary and Mallory, they had to encounter the race's only speed bump, and had to prepare the right mixture of gasoline and oil to power their VAR copyright Low Sol X motorized bicycle for the roadblock, where teams asked, "Who's ready to give a measured response?" One team member had to measure 25 parts gasoline to 1 part of oil, and had to figure out that 2 liters of gasoline would fulfill the mixture ratio. For the roadblock, one team member had to use an odometer and a VAR copyright low Solex to measure the entire length of the country of Liechtenstein, riding from Schaanwald to Balzers. At the end, they would meet up with former Winter Olympics alpine ski racer Marco Bar 1/4 and give him the distance that they traveled, written on the back of a postcard, 22 kilometers. If they were correct, Bar 1/4 would direct the racers to Gutenberg Castle where they would meet up with their teammate and read the next clue. If they were incorrect, they would have to travel back to Schaanwald and start over. The clue teams received and had to travel to Sargans, Switzerland, with a train to Zermatt. Upon arrival, teams picked up the clue at Zermatt railway station which it discovered for the detour, a choice between cheese and Wies. In cheese, teams traveled to the restaurant Wollissekan Zermatt where they would have to finish an entire pot of cheese fondue. Once the pot was empty, the restaurateur would give them an empty fondue pot with the name of the next location printed on the inside. In Wies, teams had to dress up as bellhops and then pick up pieces of luggage from the Zermatt railway station. Then, using a luggage cart, they had to deliver the suitcases to different hotels throughout Zermatt where they would receive receipt tags for each piece of luggage. Once they had a total of 20 receipt tags from at least 5 different hotels, they could trade them into the head porter for their next clue. The clues teams received where they traveled to Hinterdorf near the Inderbeinbrunnen and had to look the U-turn board. Flight time and Big Easy chose to U-turn Jet and Cord. The clue after the U-turn where they must take an electric taxi to Berg Restaurant Moose for the pit stop. Leg 10 equals. Air date, May 1, 2011, Zermatt Rescue Helicopter Port, Matterhorn, Riffelalp to Zermatt, Zermatt. Teams began the leg in Zermatt and headed to Rescue Helicopter Port in Air Zermatt. They had to sign up for a series of helicopter flights to their next location, each leaving at 5-minute intervals. Before they left on their flight, they would receive their next clue for the Mountain Rescue Task's detour before being flown onto the Matterhorn. A choice between search and rescue. In search, teams used a set of avalanche beacons to search the Matterhorn for a dummy buried in the snow. They then had to dig out the whole dummy before they could receive their next clue. In rescue, teams used a special hoisting device to rescue a mountaineer trapped in a crevasse. One team member had to lower his or her teammate into the crevasse. The lowered teammate then had to attach a carabiner to the mountaineer. The teammate at the top then had to raise the pair back to the surface. Once at the top, the rescued mountaineer would give them their next clue. The roadblock clue where teams received and took a train from Riffelalp to Zermatt, and find Le Petit Servin where they encountered the roadblock, asking, "Who wants to make a new friend?" One team member made a Travelocity roaming gnome out of Swiss chocolate. First, the team member had to decorate a chocolate mold with colored chocolate. Once the mold was properly decorated, the team member had the mold filled with chocolate and then buried it in the snow outside for 30 minutes in order to harden the chocolate. They then removed the gnome from the mold and covered up imperfections with more colored chocolate. Once the head chocolatier approved the gnome, teams would receive a real roaming gnome and their next clue. This clue directed to travel by foot to the pit stop in Chalet Gare 40 Leg 11 equals. Air date, May 8, 2011, Zermatt to Zurich, Zurich to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, Rio de Janeiro to Rio de Janeiro, Rio de Janeiro, Rio de Janeiro, Nitra Cubed Eye overlooking the Nitra Cubed Eye Contemporary Art Museum. During the pit stop, all teams were moved to Zermatt railway station to start the leg. Teams were received the clue and had to travel to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Upon arriving in the city of Rio, teams traveled by tram from Carioca Aqueduct to Escadaria Isolera Cubed N. They had to search the tile-covered steps for a route-infoed tile that would have their next clue on the back. The clue where it figure out that they had to head to Lago de Sao Paulo Francisco de Paula for the roadblock, asking, "Who's not afraid of shaking in their boots?" One team member had to participate in a Rio Carnival parade. After putting on special costumes, teams learned the samba and then led a parade of dancers. If the Carnival Princess approved their dance, teams would receive their next clue. If not, they would be sent back to relearn the dance and try again. The clue sent to Centro de Oriente Picavolt Poundo Professional Salon in Copacabana, teams had to undergo a Brazilian body waxing session for 15 minutes. Once the time was up, the beauticians would give teams their next clue. The clue turned out to be For the Detour, a choice between On the Rocks and On the Beach. In On the Rocks, teams traveled to the Espacio X bar on Avenida Atlas Ntica near Copacabana Beach where they learned to make caipirinhas. Once they made 100 proper caipirinhas, they would receive their next clue. In On the Beach, teams had to pick up an umbrella loaded with bikinis and a mobile changing station and sell the bikinis to people on the beach. The buyers then had to change into the bikinis in the mobile changing station. Once teams earned $100, they would receive their next clue. The clue sent teams to Nitrocubed Contemporary Art Museum in Nitrocubed for the pit stop. Leg 12 Air date, May 8, 2011, Rio de Janeiro to Miami, Florida, USA, Virginia Key, Key Largo, Big Pine Key, Orchid, Big Pine Key to Marathon, Knights Key, Pigeon Key. At the start of the leg, teams were informed to travel to their final destination city, Miami, Florida. Upon arrival, they had to head to Rickenbacker Marina in Virginia Key for the first roadblock, asking, "Who's confident about handling a boat?" One team member had to learn how to operate a heavy load forklift to move a boat into dry dock without dropping the boat, which would destroy it. Once the boat was successfully moved, teams would receive their next clue. The clue teams received after the first roadblock were they headed to Jules Undersea Lodge in Key Largo for the second roadblock. The team member sat out the forklift roadblock and had to use a boat submersible to search the lagoon of the Jules Undersea Lodge for one of several floating treasure chests that contained their next clue, while being surrounded by distracting mermaid divers who were swimming around them and playing music. The clue received after the second roadblock, teams were given a riddle telling them to go to the sea camp near a mile marker on Big Pine Key by subtracting 4 from 33. And they were instructed to walk across a shallow portion of the Gulf of Mexico to Horseshoe Island where they would find their next clue underneath the island's tallest tree. After getting the clue, teams were instructed to walk back to Big Pine Key where they would take a speedboat to the Galway Bay Mobile Home Park in Marathon. Once teams arrived at Galway Bay, teams had to set up a travel trailer as it appeared in a brochure for Galway Bay. Once the trailer was set up with a lawn, a pool, plastic flamingos, and a table setting, among other amenities, teams would receive their final clue from Miss Rose. The clue told teams to travel to 7 Mile Bridge. They had to ride tricycles along the bridge to Pigeon Key, the finish line. Ratings US ratings Episode 2, I Have Never Looked So Foolish in My Whole Entire Life, aired the same night as the 83rd Academy Awards. Episode 9, We Good American People, aired on Easter Sunday. Episode 10, Too Many Cooks in the Kitchen, was delayed for 1 hour in most West Coast CBS stations due to the breaking news coverage of the death of Osama bin Laden. Episode 11, This Is Where It Ends, the 2-hour season finale, aired on Mother's Day. It was the lowest-rated season finale in the show's history until the season 26 finale. Canadian ratings Canadian broadcaster CTV also airs The Amazing Race on Sundays at 8 p.m., with only 2 exceptions. Episode 2 aired an hour earlier than its normal start time due to CTV's broadcast of the 83rd Academy Awards. Episode 6 aired an hour earlier due to the said network's broadcast of the 2011 Juno Awards. Notes. References. External links, official website.